Government push booster shots to prevent further restrictions as COVID cases rise. That's our main story this morning. Also today, Wall Street hits a record high, house clearance rates fall further, and why you can always fit in Christmas pudding. It's Monday, the 13th of December 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Morning, Michael.
Then stay listening for Sean's chat to Rowan Clark from Regen Farmers Mutual, a really interesting one, that one. But first, Sean, as I mentioned, governments across the country are racing to take control of the spread of the Omicron variant of COVID-19 and avoid further restrictions, with booster shots being pushed right across the country.
That's right, Michael. There's been a rush of COVID cases, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, and all the COVID news out of Europe seems bad. But the federal government and most of the state governments are now pushing for booster vaccinations rather than restrictions. That's great news ahead of Christmas. In Victoria, there's 1,069 cases recorded yesterday, 1,181 on Saturday, and almost 1,200 on Friday. The numbers were back to mid-October levels. At the same time, there were more rallies across the country, the largest being in Melbourne. The protests were against mandated vaccines. Increasingly, though, it seems the general public is losing patience with the protesters. New South Wales recorded 485 cases of COVID yesterday and 2 deaths, and there's at least 55 cases in the state with the Omicron variant. There were 560 cases on Saturday, 550 on Friday. That's well over 1,500 in 3 days. Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt yesterday said booster shots are now essential, and people are being pushed to have third booster shots 5 months after their second jab. More than 1.5 million Australians are now eligible for that third jab. Queensland yesterday reopened its border to New South Welshmen and Victorians, with chaos expected at border crossings in the next few days. But guess what, Michael? As a result, Western Australia tightened its border with the Sunshine State.
Of course it did. All right. How did markets finish up on Friday, Sean?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.4% to finish the week at 7,354 points, with healthcare and energy stocks falling sharply. For the week, the bourse was up 1.5% though. There was plenty of red ink in the market on Friday. CSL closed down 2%. The four major banks were lower, as were BHP and Aristocrat Leisure. Wesfarmers and South32 were the best performers among the large caps at least, both up 0.5%.
And what about overseas markets?
Well, Wall Street closed at a record high, with a broad-based S&P 500 finishing up 1%, taking the gains this calendar year to 27%. Pretty remarkable. The automobile makers did particularly well, with Ford up almost 10% and General Motors 6% higher. The rally came despite November inflation figures coming in at 6.8%. Now, that's as the market expected, but it's pretty high. In fact, it's the highest in almost 40 years. At least it was what was forecast, and that adds somewhat to the theory that the pace of price rises has peaked and will perhaps come back. If that happens, interest rates are less likely to increase, hence you got that rally. In the US at the moment, consumer spending remains really strong and corporate profits are rising. If interest rates don't rise too quickly, then most analysts expect Wall Street will keep rising, and of course that augurs well for the local market. European markets entered the weekend slightly lower ahead of central bank meetings in Germany and the UK later this week. In fact, according to Bloomberg, 20 central banks around the world are meeting this week on interest rates. Oil prices also rose to close 8% higher for the full week. That's the strongest rally in almost 4 months. Gold was flat for the week. And the Aussie dollar kicks off Monday at just under 72 US cents.
Okay, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, there's plenty of stories around this morning. It was a record weekend for home auctions, another one, with 4,970 houses going under the hammer nationally. How did it all go?
It was good without being great, with a national clearance rate of 66.6%. That's according to CoreLogic. As you mentioned, it was the biggest weekend since CoreLogic began keeping records back in 2008, beating last weekend's record numbers. Melbourne had 2,300 auctions and a clearance rate of 65%. Sydney had almost 1,800 auctions with a clearance rate of 64%. Now, anecdotally, prices still remain pretty high. Adelaide had the best clearance rate at 84% based on more than 300 auctions. It all comes as ANZ joined some of the other lenders in lifting its fixed rate mortgages on Friday.
Now, Sean, the tax office released its corporate transparency report on Friday, and it showed improved voluntary tax compliance among large corporates.
Yes, look, it's not exactly bedtime reading, but it's kind of interesting. Let me give you a few facts and figures first. The companies in the report paid over $57 billion in tax. Now, the big jump in recent years has come from the mining companies as iron ore prices have increased. The Tax Avoidance Task Force has collected about $10 billion over the past 5 years, and about 1/3 of companies in the report paid no tax, zero, presumably because they made no money or they have tax losses that they could carry forward or are part of a bigger organisation that presumably did pay tax. The top 10 firms paid $25 billion in tax. That's a lot of money. That group includes the big banks, the major miners, Wesfarmers and Telstra. Rio is the number one taxpayer in the country, followed by BHP, Commonwealth Bank and Fortescue Metals. Tech giants Facebook, Apple and Google paid a combined $190 million, with an M, $190 million in tax from revenue of around $11 billion. By my calculation, that's less than 2%.
That's pretty extraordinary.
It is, and that's why we do need that 15% corporate tax rate around the world.
Yeah, makes sense. And the competition regulator released its annual communications market report.
Yes, it's that time of year. These types of reports often provide a great insight into consumer behaviour. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission found that the big telcos, that's Telstra, Optus and TPG, the big three, generally did a pretty good job during the pandemic, but broadband and mobile prices have risen over the past year, and most people aren't using the data they're paying for. In fact, on average, over the past couple of years, consumers only used 11.8 gigabytes of data per month, compared to the median data allowance of 35 gigabytes. Along the same lines, the ACCC's latest petrol monitoring report shows that motorists are currently paying the highest petrol prices in 7 years. Now, Michael, I know a week ago I predicted petrol prices would come down.
Yes, you did. I recall that very, very clearly.
I was wrong. They are still sky high.
Yes, they are. Now, Sean, we've also got some information now about which companies received JobKeeper payments and who paid them back. This is from ASIC.
It did. The recipient of the largest amount of JobKeeper payments was Qantas for its 27,000 employees. Now, Qantas got $850 million in support. That was almost 3 times the size of the next in line, and that was Crown Resorts, which received almost $300 million. Then came Flight Centre, the Star Entertainment Group and Myer Holdings. The top 20 list is dominated by travel, retail and entertainment companies, all really big employers, so no surprises there. Special shout out to Cochlear, number 17 in that list. The Hearing Implant Group received $33 million in JobKeeper payments, but repaid $23 million. Now, as I've reported before, the pandemic actually helped Cochlear because when everyone was wearing masks, people became more aware of their hearing loss because they couldn't lip read. And that actually boosted Cochlear's revenue.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible story, that one, isn't it?
Sure is. One of my favourite stories of the year, I think.
Yeah. And finally, Sean, there is a reason why even when you've had a huge Christmas lunch, there is still room for pudding.
Yes. It's called the sensory-specific satiety mechanism. Sensory-specific satiety mechanism. I have to credit the Financial Review for this story. Apparently, variety excites the appetite, and it's evolutionary. When our predecessors binged on buffalo or something, then found a patch of ripe berries, skipping the nutrients in the berries really wasn't an option. So no matter how full they were, they ate the berries. So as a result, the body developed different limits for different foods as a way to help ensure a balanced intake of nutrients. It's actually one of the reasons that most people eat a fairly balanced diet, even though most of us know very little about nutrition. It's even more prevalent in kids than adults. And eventually, when you eat too much, the gut will release a hormone that causes nausea after about 1,500 calories. So there you go. No matter how much you eat, at lunchtime, there's still room for pudding.
Yeah, there's probably the most technical reason I've ever heard for the fact that people just have a dessert stomach. That's the way I've always considered it. There's always a second stomach with room for dessert.
But it's true. There really is.
Okay, Sean, what's making headlines in today's news media?
There's not a lot around this morning, Michael. The Australian is reporting that the federal government will partially underwrite up to $7 billion in new loans for small businesses hit by the Delta wave lockdowns in a bid to fuel a post-COVID investment boom. It comes ahead of this week's mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, and that's about it.
Running through some of the other stories around today, the CEO of Fortescue Metals, Elizabeth Gaines, will step down. Now, Sean, you mentioned this one in Friday's afternoon report. She's going to take up a non-executive director's role. Ms. Gaines is well respected and no doubt had her work cut out working with a very hands-on chair in Andrew Forrest.
No doubt. IOOF will change its name to Insignia. It's pretty much at the end of an era. The Independent Order of Oddfellows was established in Sydney in 1836 to help members through sickness and unemployment. It's listed now, of course, and it's the country's largest financial advice group. It's had a tough trot recently with its share price down 27% since the middle of August, but IOOF will soon be no longer. Instead, it will be called Insignia.
I never knew that was what IOOF stood for.
Independent Order of Oddfellows.
Seems like kind of late in the piece for me to learn that piece of trivia, considering the name is now changing. But Sean, a beer story. We love a beer story. It's being rationed across some bottle shops as Australia's two largest brewers face delivery delays and shortages coming into Christmas. According to The Australian, this is not good news. Lion and Carlton and United Breweries have both issued warnings to customers and sales reps with limits in place at BWS shops for beers such as VB, Pure Blonde and Carlton. One of the country's most popular beers, Corona, which is imported from Mexico by CUB, is suffering such massive supply issues, stores are restricted to order a maximum of 20 cartons each per week. Not what you want to hear coming into Christmas.
Now, I quite like Corona, and I have a feeling this was the same story as last year.
Well, Sean, it's probably time to stock up quickly while you still can.
Yeah, it might be too late. And finally, Michael, ASX-listed campervan rentals group Apollo Tourism will merge with New Zealand-based rival Tourism Holdings to form a company with a combined fleet of 7,000 vehicles. Apollo's been hammered by COVID, no doubt about that, but its share price jumped 25% on news of the merger.
Big move. And what's the key overseas news this morning, Sean?
A two-shot course of the Pfizer vaccine has just 22.5% efficacy against symptomatic infection with the Omicron variant, though it can stop serious illness. That's according to a South African study. It comes as the worst case forecast puts the death toll in the United Kingdom this winter at potentially 75,000 if the government doesn't impose more restrictions. The lower case was closer to 25,000. Wherever it comes in, that's a lot of people, and that's according to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Michael, I mentioned earlier in the show the US inflation figures. Democrats in the US are pushing the Federal Reserve to move more aggressively to tighten monetary policy to stamp out inflation. The Fed's meeting this week, and the unusual amount of political pressure comes ahead of midterm elections later next year. I find it slightly ironic that the Democrats, wanting to get re-elected, are calling on the Fed to lift interest rates. And finally, more than 70 people have died in Kentucky after tornadoes tore through the state. The storms were described as the most severe in Kentucky's history. The death toll is expected to approach 100. The city of Mayfield, which is home to 10,000 people, has largely been destroyed. I'm not sure whether you saw the photos, Michael, but it was a disaster zone.
Yeah, absolutely devastating. Really, really frightening stuff. Now, Sean, up next is the Daily Interview, and today you're speaking to Rowan Clark, one of the founders of Regen Farmers Mutual.
It's a really interesting concept. Basically, they've taken not the very large properties, but the mid-sized properties, created a co-op style setup so that those farmers can take advantage of the environmental assets they own and potentially sell carbon credits, that type of thing. Really, really worth listening to.
Yeah, certainly is. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. But there's also plenty of other good listening in the playlist. You'll find today our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas, with the week ahead. What was coming up this week, Sean?
Yep, there's always plenty going on in the world of economics. Labour force is the big one this week. We're all interested to see if the unemployment rate can rebound somewhat after jumping to 5.2% during October.
And of course, Sean, while you're there having a listen to our other podcasts, make sure you make a bit of time for the Sunday edition, which is definitely a lighter look at the world of business.
I'd say a more embarrassing look at the world, and I'm not even sure business.
I think that's probably a good way to put it. They are all in the Fear and Greed playlist. You can find them all on fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Monday, the 13th of December, 2021. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.